Hey, 8th graders, it's Mr. Mueller here, and we're going to begin our unit on the Civil War. So throughout this unit, we're going to be looking at the war where our states were literally fighting each other between 1861 and 1865. All right, so we had briefly mentioned this in the last unit, but let's talk here about what's going on here at the beginning of the Civil War. So the first shots of the Civil War are fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, in April of 1861 after Abraham Lincoln is elected. And as the war begins, the two sides in the Civil War are the Union, which is the North, and the Confederacy, which is the South. You can see that on the map there. Those in the darker blue are the Union or the North, the United States of America, and those in the gray are the Confederate States of America. And as the war begins, each side sort of has their own set of strengths. So on the northern side, the Union strengths is they have more men to fight in the war. They have about 2.5 times the amount of soldiers that the South does. They've got better factories to produce all the things they need to fight war. They can make more guns and cannons and everything they need. And they've got a really good and extensive railroad system to move things around. On the Confederacy or southern side, they've got some strengths of their own. They have cotton, which they've been raising and selling, which has made them very rich, so they can use the profits from that cotton to really help them out. They by far have better military leadership. As we'll see, their generals are much better, and they have motivated soldiers because from a southern perspective, they're going to be fighting for their own independence. So as a recap here, these are just some of the causes of the Civil War that we looked at in the last unit. Some of these things on over here, the debate over slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act. And then ultimately, as we see here, it was Lincoln's election in 1860 that really started the Civil War. So the southern states begin to secede or formally leave the Union, and the Civil War then officially breaks out in April of 1861 with the first shots being fired at the federal fort at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Now, as the war begins here, this gentleman here who you see on your screen named Robert E. Lee, he was originally part of the U.S. military. He was the guy who stopped the raid at Harper's Ferry with John Brown. He's probably the best military mind in the country at this time. Abraham Lincoln knows that and actually offers Robert E. Lee command of the entire Union Army at the start of the war. Lee, though, turns down Lincoln's offer, and instead he quits the U.S. Army and he decides to lead what's called the Army of Northern Virginia. He's the general, basically, of the main Confederate Army, and it's really going to be Lee's leadership in the Civil War that keeps the Southern Army afloat throughout much of the conflict. Now, the first official battle of the Civil War is called the Battle of Bull Run. Sometimes it's also referred to as Manassas because it takes place near Manassas, Virginia. And what's important to point out here is that at the start of the Civil War, neither side, the North or the South, thought this war was going to last very long. Both thought maybe a few months, certainly no more than a year. Nobody could envision that this war would drag on for 4 bloody years and ultimately cost the lives of 600,000 soldiers. But the first battle here at Bull Run takes place just about 40 or 50 miles outside of Washington, D.C., and it ends up being a Confederate victory. It's sort of a shocking Confederate victory, but the Confederates are too exhausted after this battle to follow up with an attack on Washington, D.C., and it's pretty clear after the first battle at Bull Run here that the war is going to last much, much longer than anybody anticipated. The next major battle that I'd like us to take a look at is what's called the Battle of Antietam, sometimes also referred to as the Battle of Sharpsburg, which happens a little over a year later after the Battle of Bull Run. Happens in September 1862. And the Battle of Antietam, still to this day, is the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. The Northern general at this time is named George McClellan. He's by nature a very cautious general, but he figures out where Robert E. Lee's troops are going to be at, and he decides that he is going to go and meet the Southern Army near Sharpsburg, Maryland, near a place called Antietam Creek. Now, what ensues on September 17th, 1862 is just a complete bloodbath. There's 23,000 casualties between the North and the South. Again, it's the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. And at the end of the day, the Union or the North holds the field, so they technically win this battle, but nobody really wins at Antietam just because the body count is so high. What's really significant about the Battle of Antietam is that the Battle of Antietam, this victory here, really gives Abraham Lincoln the confidence to formally announce something he'd been considering for a while, which is called the Emancipation Proclamation. And we'll talk more about that Emancipation Proclamation and the significance of that here in just a second. Now, after the battle is over, Abraham Lincoln, who you can see here in this picture, he asks George McClellan, who you can also see in this picture, this is them in a tent outside the Battle of Antietam here. He asked McClellan to follow up with an attack and to pursue Robert E. Lee and the army, the Southern Army. McClellan, though, being the cautious person that he is, refuses to do so. And because he refuses to follow Lincoln's orders, Lincoln removes him for insubordination. I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to see George McClellan re-enter the story here again in 1864. So let's come back here to this idea of the Emancipation Proclamation. So again, after the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issues the preliminary version of this executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. It's officially released to the world on January 1st, 1863. And here is what the Emancipation Proclamation does, guys. The Emancipation Proclamation, by executive order from the president, frees all slaves in southern states that are in active rebellion against the United States. So basically, all of the Confederate States of America, the slaves in those territories are henceforth going to be forever free. And the other thing that it does that's really important here, and I've underlined it on the screen, is that formally now, Abraham Lincoln is welcoming former slaves and African Americans into the Army. And this is going to be huge because by the time the Civil War is over, nearly 200,000 African Americans are going to serve in the Union Army, which is pretty incredible. Lincoln feels that by issuing this Emancipation Proclamation, which frees the slaves in southern states, he's basically dealing two blows to the South. One is he's taking away their workforce off the plantation field, and he's also increasing the size of his army. All right, so now we're officially into the year 1863, and we're about halfway through the Civil War at this point. And 1863, there's a lot of things that happen, but perhaps the most significant thing that happens in 1863 is going to be the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg happens over a 3-day period, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. This is going to be the most decisive battle of the war and is really going to be the major turning point in the Civil War. Now on this map here, you can kind of maybe get a sense of where the different lines are. Again, it's a 3-day battle that's occurring here. And the Union line is on the center of this map. You can see it kind of makes a little fish hook here. So from the outside, the Confederates are the ones attacking. They're the arrows on the outside that are coming in and attacking the Union on the inside. And in the middle there, you can see where it says July 3rd and where it says Picketts Charge. That July 3rd day is going to be critically important because on July 3rd, Robert E. Lee is going to order a direct attack at the Union line there, which is called Picketts Charge. This attack is ultimately going to fail, and this is going to lead to massive Confederate casualties and a huge, huge Union victory here at Gettysburg. So after Pickett's Charge and the devastation there from the Confederate Army, Lee basically gives up his plans of invading the North. This is Lee attempting to go in and invade the North through Pennsylvania. And you can see here the casualty rates at the end of this are just catastrophic. 23,000 Union soldiers are dead, wounded, or missing. 28,000 Confederate soldiers are dead, wounded, or missing. And, you know, this idea that Robert E. Lee had built up that he had been invincible, really from this point forward is broken because Gettysburg is going to be a massive turning point. But perhaps one of the things that we remember most from Gettysburg isn't necessarily even the battle itself, but is in fact a speech that Abraham Lincoln gives afterwards called the Gettysburg Address. Months later, in November of 1863, Abraham Lincoln is invited back to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery there. And he gives one of the great speeches in all of American history called the Gettysburg Address. Now on Canvas, I've posted an assignment called the Gettysburg Address. I'd like you to read through the Gettysburg Address, and I have some questions that I'd like you to answer about it and really think about, what is Lincoln saying here in the speech? What is he arguing for, and what are his motivations for why he's saying what he's saying here? And it's a really incredible and powerful speech that really defines what America is all about. So please get onto Canvas and make sure you do that assignment. Now, at the same time that all these battles are happening out sort of on the East Coast, you have another guy here who you see, Ulysses S. Grant. He is out fighting on the western frontier, and he's having a lot of success out there. Now, we're going to talk about Grant because that's really significant. He's ultimately going to be the main general of the entire Union Army. But as you can see here, Grant throughout 1862 and then into 1863 is going to have a number of important Union victories out west. The most important of these victories that Grant is going to have actually happens the exact same time that Gettysburg happens. Ulysses S. Grant and the western half of the Union Army, they're going to go and surround Vicksburg, Mississippi. They're going to lay siege to it. And on July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg is going to surrender over to the Union forces. And why this is really significant is because once the Union, the North, captures Vicksburg, they take control of the entire Mississippi River. And in doing so, they've essentially cut the Confederacy in half. They've controlled the Mississippi River. They can control moving things up and down the Mississippi River. And they've essentially cut the Confederacy in half. So you can see that here on this map, that once they've taken control of Vicksburg, they've got control of the Mississippi River. So after these series of sort of really bad defeats from the Confederacy, they're still fighting on and hoping that they can hold on and continue to fight. But as we move into 1864 and 1865, the Union is continuing to push in and take over more and more southern land. And as we get into 1865, Lincoln really wants to deal a blow to the South. And he turns to a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman to do that. Sherman is appointed by Ulysses S. Grant, who Grant at this point is the commander of all Union forces. But what William Tecumseh Sherman does here, it's called Sherman's March to the Sea. He captures Atlanta, Georgia, and then he's going to go and he's just basically going to have this whole path of destruction, this whole swath of destruction as he moves all the way out to the sea. It's called Sherman's March to the Sea. They destroy and burn everything in their path. And the reason that he does that is he's basically trying to completely break the back or break the spirit of the Confederacy, which in many respects he does. Now in 1864, here's the other thing. 1864 is an election year, and actually in 1864, Lincoln has to run for re-election, and the person that he's running against in 1864 is none other than George McClellan, the guy he just fired after Antietam. And it looks, though, as in 1864 that Lincoln may not win re-election because George McClellan is promising to end the war and to negotiate a peace settlement with the South. But after Sherman captures Atlanta and there's a series of Union victories, Lincoln's re-election is assured. He wins 55% of the vote. Lincoln pushes on and basically forces the South into unconditional surrender, which happens at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, where Robert E. Lee will surrender his army over to Ulysses S. Grant. And essentially at that point, the Civil War is over. Almost 4 years to the date that it started at Fort Sumter, it ends at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. But the war lasts way longer than anybody thought or predicted it would, and the casualty figures are just completely staggering. So here it really is the legacy of the Civil War. 620,000 men die in the Civil War. Now, to put that in perspective, that's essentially more Americans die in the Civil War than all of the other wars America has fought combined. Just unbelievable destruction and suffering that the Civil War wreaks on the country. The Union is ultimately going to be reunited at the end of this, which was Lincoln's stated purpose for fighting the war from the outset. Slavery will ultimately be abolished by the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And really what's also established here is that the Constitution and the federal government are strengthened as the supreme law of the land. State governments are not more powerful than the national government, which is one argument that Southern states were making. The Civil War settles that question, that the Constitution and the federal government are the supreme law of the land. And this chart here just gives you a sense of the total number of forces that fought on each side. So you can see here on the top, the Union has 2.1 million men that fight in the Civil War, compared to the Confederate forces, which only had 800,000. So the Union really does just have an overwhelming force and strength there that you can see. And the Union loses more men than the Confederacy too, because more Union soldiers fight. So just to kind of wrap up here then, guys, again, here are kind of the major effects of the Civil War. Slavery is abolished. The federal government assumes supreme national authority. Both sides lose thousands of young men, 620,000 young men. The northern economy, for the most part, after the Civil War booms. The southern economy and the southern states are just completely devastated because most of the fighting takes place in the South, and the Union is ultimately reunited. So if you're to combine both kind of the causes and effects there, you can see this is kind of the last unit and then our current unit here. You can see there are all the things leading up to and causing the Civil War, and there are the effects of the Civil War afterwards. So thanks so much for watching this, guys. I hope this brief overview of the Civil War is helpful as you walk through the assignments and have your own study of the Civil War. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you later.